All right, so as people are filing in, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Becca, and I am a bookseller at Belmont Books. However, I'm currently studying in Saratoga Springs at Skidmore College right now. And Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. So you can pretty much find us right outside of Cambridge. And just so you guys know, there are a number of other virtual events coming up in September. So one of which is Jane Ward, who's the author of In the Aftermath, and she will be in conversation with Virginia Pye on September 21st, as well as Adele Nozadar, author of The Tree Forager, who's in conversation with Rebecca Buck on September 22nd. We're also hosting a workshop titled How to Tell Stories to Children with authors Joseph Sarosi and Silk Rose West, which will be taking place on September 29th. So you can register for all of these events at our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Finding the Right Words. So if you have any concerns during the event, please feel free to message me in the chat. But if you have any questions for the authors, we do ask that you put that in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hope to get to as many of your questions as possible. So we're very excited to welcome Cindy Weinstein, Bruce Miller, and Rachel Adams. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them, and then I'll turn the event over to them. So first, we have Professor Cindy Weinstein, who is the author of the new novel, Finding the Right Words. Weinstein received her BA in English and American Literature from Brandeis University. She then went on to receive her PhD in English from UC Berkeley. She's currently the Eli and Edith Broad Professor of English and has been at the California Institute of Technology since 1989, during which she has published 3 monographs on American literature, edited several volumes, and taught numerous classes. Weinstein was an Atlantic Fellow in the Global Brain Health Institute based at UCSF and Trinity College Dublin, where she studied neurology and worked with Dr. Bruce Miller on Finding the Right Words. Dr. Bruce Miller, who also worked on Finding the Right Words. He holds the A.W. and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professorship in Neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, where he directs the Memory and Aging Center. He is the principal investigator of the NIH-sponsored Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and Program Project on Frontotemporal Dementia, and he is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. In 2015, he helped found the Global Brain Health Institute and the Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health program, which he now co-directs. Lastly, we have Rachel Adams, who is a professor of English and Comparative Literature and senior faculty teaching scholar at Columbia University. Professor Adams specializes in 20th and 21st century literatures of the United States and the Americas, disability studies and health humanities, media studies, theories of race, gender and sexuality, and food studies. The book of hers featured in today's event is titled Raising Henry, a Memoir of Motherhood, Disability, and Discovery, published by Yale University Press in 2013, and winner of the 2014 Delta Kappa Gamma Educators Award. So you can find even more information about these 3 authors on our website, and I'll send a link out to that shortly. So we're so excited to have you all here with us this evening, and without further ado, I'll turn the event over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becca, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Belmont Books, and Bruce, of course, and Rachel for moderating, and for all of you joining us this late afternoon in California, evening on the East Coast. I thought I would start the discussion by reading just a very brief excerpt from Finding the Right Words, and then turn things over to Rachel, who will ask me and Bruce a series of questions about the memoir that Bruce and I wrote together. The passage that I'm going to read is from the first chapter of Finding the Right Words, which is about diagnosis, and my section is called Hitting the Fan. We have a series of chapters, and they're divided up between me talking about my father's dementia from the point of view of a daughter losing her father and an English professor. And then Bruce responds from the perspective of a neurologist and a doctor and a son and a grandson. And so this is just a brief section from Hitting the Fan. In the language of literature, the order of events make up the plot, which informs an interpretation. In the language of medicine, the order of the symptoms creates a plot of the disease, which in turn allows for diagnosis. As an English professor and the daughter of a father who had early onset Alzheimer's disease with the logopenic variant, I find the language of atrophy, aphasia, sulci, and logopenic variant at once powerful and weirdly comforting. I feel enriched by these words, partly because learning new words, even ones that translate into pain, makes me happy, and partly because they tell a story about my father that, looking back, might have been valuable to me at the time he was ill. They exude accuracy and stability. So what if they are constructed and make sense only until the next discovery is made, and then they have to move over to make room for new words? These are in contrast to the emotional quagmire of grief, love, and guilt with which I have been preoccupied for a very long time. It might have helped even just a little bit to have known that my dad's losses had biological and chemical origins. So I'll stop there. And I think that gives you a little bit of a taste of what the book is about. And Rachel, do you want to ask some questions?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be part of this discussion. I've been talking to Cindy for some time about the conception of this book. And I think having had the privilege of reading an advanced copy, I think you can see how beautifully it's written from that passage. Now, I think Cindy and Bruce intended to respond. Both of them will respond to each of my questions. So I had one that was kind of a pair, and I think I'll ask to both of you and with a slightly different twist to each of you. So for Cindy, I was curious about what made you want to write this book now, so many decades after your father's death and your experience of losing someone to Alzheimer's, and what you had learned from that distance. And then for Bruce, when Cindy approached you, what made you want to participate in this project? And then did you have any worries? Were there reservations about this kind of collaboration?
It took me decades to get to the point where I was able to write this book, both in terms of my professional career and the expectations that Caltech had for my publishing. There were lots of things I wanted to say about American literature, lots of articles I wanted to write. But in the back of my mind, there was always this noise that I wanted to write a book about my father, for my father, about my grief. And it turned out I realized that in telling my story, I might be able to help other people going through this experience. And it took me a very long time to get my head around a few things. What the book was going to look like. I knew I didn't want to write this memoir by myself. And in terms of the genre, that's strange. Bruce didn't know my father. How could he help me write a memoir about someone he didn't know? But I was passionate about wanting to find a neurologist / doctor who could tell the story of my father's dementia with me and could describe the neurology behind the very painful clinical presentations that I heard or saw, by which I mean conversations on the phone where my father couldn't speak, behaviors that I did see when I would visit my family on the East Coast. I was already in California for much of this, and witnessing my father's behavior was difficult. So getting to a place in my own life where I felt ready to tell the story and ready to grieve and finally say goodbye to my father just took a very long time. And finding Bruce took a long time as well. It probably took me about a decade. I worked with one person for a little while at UCLA, and that was not a collaboration that was going to work. And it was really through sheer luck that I ended up finding Bruce. But just to go back to the original point, why did I want to write this book? I needed to explain to myself, and I thought maybe to others, this very painful synchronicity in my life, which was I was studying literature, becoming an expert in language, in reading at the same time that my father was losing language. And it was that very difficult combination of things that it took me decades to figure out how to talk about.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, Cindy is extraordinarily distinguished, and getting to meet her and hear how compelling her story was and how passionate she was about wanting to write it. I mean, for me, there was no choice. There was only, I must do this. And with my sheer overconfidence, I truly believed I could be helpful here. And of course, my biggest doubt was, would I deliver? And I think Cindy doubted at some points whether I could deliver too. But I think for me, it was really joyous. I learned so much about writing from Cindy. And Cindy pushed me a lot to think about myself and asked me to put more of me into the book. And I learned a lot about my parents as I thought about how Cindy went through this journey. And the other thing I learned is that a lot of the language that we have to describe memory is very, very shaky. And so that was, one of the many things that I learned writing the book, but never a doubt, and always truly honored and excited.
Thanks. I mean, I really think that the collaboration is one of the things that's so special about this book. And I really think it's a very interesting model, as well as, telling a compelling story and providing some very valuable medical information. So I guess I'm going to ask you, and we'll get to the content more in a minute, but a little more about the project and whether you see this as a model for other collaborations between doctors and patients or family members. So is this the kind of project that is only possible when you have a literature professor who's, so capable of writing and reading, and a medical practitioner? Or is there some way you could scale up, maybe on a smaller level, where other people could have access to an experience like this? Have you thought about ways that you might share this activity with others, just in a more structural sense?
Bruce, do you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, and I haven't, in my own mind, kind of come to grips with it. A few comments. I think one of the things that we learned about the Global Brain Health Institute, which we were able to start in 2015, it focused on protecting brain health, in particular for underserved populations, that even more eloquent than scientists from these regions were the artists. And I think they have taught me that we do a very bad job of telling the stories of the people that we really want to help. We don't engage them enough in the process, which is part of their healing as well. And they just have massive amounts to teach us about the brain. So, I think getting Cindy to think through with me about what memory was like in her dad and how we translate that to people. I mean, I think this is an incredibly powerful model. of going forward and changing science in a really positive way. I mean, I just, sorry for being a little long-winded, but some of the most important findings in my space, like the description of a certain type of language disorder called semantic aphasia, was actually described by Gabriel Garcia Marquez before any scientist was aware of this type of language disorder. And I think you see this again and again, that literary people with their imagination will tell you things that eventually scientists, take credit for, but way after the fact. Yeah.
I would respond to that excellent question as follows. I don't think that people need to collaborate on a book to get the kind of energy, the kind of support that I hope this book produces in readers. But I do think that on a kind of micro level, when patients and their families are in a room with a neurologist, that if there were a way to use this collaboration with Bruce to convey the importance of just taking a few moments, either at the beginning and or the end of an appointment, to just check in and say, how are you? Or was there something that I explained that you don't understand? Do you want me to go and show you where the parietal lobe is and where the cells are dying? Like, will that help you? And I think that if the book gets in the hands of the right people who then see the importance of the dialogue between the family and the doctor, that could have such a beneficial effect for families dealing with this kind of diagnosis.
Yeah, so I really hear two different levels of answer, and one is about the doctor kind of doing their intended job better, being patient, explaining to families. But then also, I really like the way Bruce talks about, seeing more, I don't have a better word for it than like the full humanity of patients and their families by listening to stories. And so I hope that like the power of the project will come across to readers, as well as the story it has to tell about Alzheimer's. Now I'm going to go in the other direction. So I can't remember if this was mentioned in the introduction, but one of the things I find remarkable about this project is that Cindy spent time studying neurology to help her to write this book. So, one of the great things about being a professor is that you have opportunities to learn as well. So I was hoping that you would talk about that and what you learned about Alzheimer's through study that you might not have known as a lay person, what you would like to share. And I guess the underlying question then is, and maybe Bruce can chime in too, is it always helpful for family members to learn as much as they can about an illness like Alzheimer's? Or is there any limit to that? Is there a point when having too much knowledge can be a bad thing and can actually harm the time that people have to spend with each other?
I'll start with that. I mentioned earlier that in thinking about this project, I always knew that I wanted to write it with someone else, and that someone else would be a physician, a neurologist, and just amazing that I ended up with one of the most internationally renowned neurologists studying frontotemporal dementia, but knowing a whole lot about all kinds of dementia. And I emailed Bruce, and this was a few years before I got to UCSF, and he kindly said, come on over to my office and tell me about your project. And we hit it off, and he said, do you want to learn some science? And I said, yeah. And he said, then you need to apply to this interdisciplinary program, which I did, and I got into. And the program was really mind-blowing in the best way possible. I attended classes twice a week. I went to seminars, grand rounds that doctors and other neurologists at UCSF presented their work about dementia. I got to follow neurologists and hear them talking to their patients. I got to sit in on the tests that were given to people who were experiencing certain symptoms of dementia. And I learned an incredible amount. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was to explain in layperson's terms what I learned. I learned a bunch of things, including the fact that you don't get Alzheimer's overnight. There's a period of 10 to 20 years called the prodromal phase, where the disease is lurking. And when you start seeing what's called clinical presentations of the disease, that's been at work in the brain for a really long time. So some of the symptoms that my father had years before he was diagnosed started making sense. He had hearing difficulties. This was in the 70s. My mother took my dad to a hearing doctor. His hearing was quote unquote fine. And then the doctor said, how long have you been married? And my mother said, for decades. And the doctor said, well, he just doesn't want to listen to you anymore. And when I told Bruce that story, he said, okay, that is going to be part of a chapter on diagnosis. So hearing issues are really important. My father had sleeping difficulties. Sleep is crucial for brain health. Bruce can maybe talk a little bit more about that. Hearing, sleep. The other thing I learned, whatever is good for the body is good for the brain. I had this very academic notion that somehow the brain was separate from everything else. But if you're taking care of your heart by being on a Mediterranean diet and exercising, you're also taking care of your brain. These are maybe obvious things, but I did not know them going into it. And what I learned is that there are all sorts of preventative measures that people can take to ward off the onslaught of symptoms. And you can buy yourself some good years if you take good care of your body and your brain. So those are just a few things that I learned along the way.
I mean, Cindy just touched on one of the real flaws of the neurology field. When I started, I became a neurologist in 1983. And you know, there was an attitude that our responsibility is to make a diagnosis and then we're done. And that's it. And this, I don't know, kind of a little bit of contempt for people's feelings, for, you know, Cindy's mom, and really missing the boat entirely, that this was actually the beginning of a disorder of communication. And it was probably more than hearing. And there were probably preventive things that could have been done then that would have been helpful to the disease course, but certainly been helpful to Cindy and Mom and Jerry. I mean, so her story kind of put the hair on the back of my neck up. And I think more and more we have to think about ways that we engage the family unit and think about how we can improve their lot and how we can help them cope better with what is a very tough problem. And this idea of blame, you know, it's just filtered through all of neurology and psychiatry for almost 100 years. Mother was to blame for the autism. Cindy's mom was to blame because she was talking too much. Or, I mean, this is something that you still see. And, I think you can just forget it. I mean, I say this to our trainees. This is a biological illness. 99 times out of 100, there is no fault. There is no blame. The disease is the blame.
So, thank you for that. So this in a way anticipates my next question, which you may feel that you've already answered, but I mean, because this book tells a story that happened some decades before, it does really give us an interesting historical view. And so I was wondering if each of you could talk from your perspective. I mean, Bruce, you have mostly focused on the addition of care for the family, which does seem like a really important feature, but more generally, how things have changed in both the treatment and then also, how you diagnose people with Alzheimer's in the time that you've been working. And then perhaps Cindy would want to speak to that, what you've learned about patient experiences since you went through this.
Great. Well, I had phenomenally good luck in that I had two wonderful mentors at UCLA. I went there to work with them, Frank Benson and Jeff Cummings, and they changed, I think, the way we approach degenerative diseases of the brain. In 1983, when I started my fellowship, everything was Alzheimer's disease. There was no other illness. And the pharmaceutical industry then jumped on this idea that there was $1 trillion business if we could just cure Alzheimer's disease. So they focused on the amyloid protein. And we really saw 30 years of one illness, one protein. And like a lot of things in life, it was a lot more complicated than that. And I think a lot of my life in this space has been increasing precision, making sure we know what Alzheimer's is, and when we make a diagnosis that we're accurate. And I think we can be now with biomarkers, even blood tests, we are getting very close to 100% certainty when we make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So I think the diagnosis has improved enormously. All these social determinants of health, I think, have come into our purview. And now I think really logical therapies to prevent the bad proteins from aggregating or increasing their clearance from the brain are starting to emerge. So, I mean, I think I feel really badly for all the people in 1985 when Jerry Weinstein was diagnosed, what they went through. And I think of all of the people who were misdiagnosed during that time, given the wrong therapies. So I think I really believe in precision for physicians. We have to get it right. I often say to our trainees, we're the last opportunity to solve this problem. If we don't solve it, it ain't going to be solved. And so I think this focus on precision, getting it right, understanding that there are other diseases that affect the brain, has been part of my journey. And I think we're in a better space now.
I would say that one of the most profound moments for me, just to follow up on what Bruce said about diagnosis, one of the most profound moments at UCSF was when Bruce gave me a diagnosis that went beyond just Alzheimer's. It was early onset Alzheimer's, which means a diagnosis before 65. My father was in his 50s. So early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant. And what that meant was that the circuitry of language was what got hit first. And in that moment, as hard as it was to hear that, the precision of it was so illuminating and explanatory. So all that Bruce just said about precision diagnosis, I think, is hugely important for the family. In terms of the retrospective aspect of the story, there has just been a tremendous amount of progress in terms of caregiving for people with dementia. In the interdisciplinary group I was part of, we had someone who focused on the architecture in which people with dementia find themselves and trying to redesign emergency rooms, because people with dementia often come in hallucinating or leave hallucinating. And how does the lighting, how does the flooring, how do the visual structures of those spaces help or hinder the person with dementia? We had a person working on dance and dementia, and the ways in which accessing muscle memory through dance could be really empowering for the person with dementia. And maybe most importantly, and Oliver Sacks talks about this, is the power of music to bring out aspects of memory that aren't so reliant on language. And so people who maybe can't put a sentence together, you start playing music and they know all the lyrics to the song, and how beneficial that is both for the person with dementia and the family who gets to see the person they love and a part of their identity that remains. That said, I do think that there are some problematic consistencies over the course of decades. There was just an article in the New York Times about the use of antipsychotic drugs in nursing homes. And Bruce and I spent a lot of time talking about that. And in the book, I talk about how my father was basically Big Pharma's dream come true, just throwing more medicine into him. I think the goal was to anesthetize him, and that led to some terrible, terrible things. I think that many of the doctors, most of the doctors, at least that I interacted with at UCSF, were well aware of the problems that come with over medication. Sometimes it's necessary. But I hope that especially that Times article will make a dent, and there will be more hesitation when it comes to giving the person with dementia, especially antipsychotic drugs.
I might make one just quick comment. And I think if you're interested in quality and really helping a family and the person afflicted, all of the aspects of care are really become really important. It isn't just the medicines we give, it's, is the caregiver getting respite. And I just wanted to reflect, in a slightly negative way, that this has probably, been one of the most inhumane 2 years for elders living in nursing facilities in the history of our country. I mean, and I think it's multiplied even more so in South America, where people don't have the resources to deal with caregiving and keeping a job and getting your loved one to wear a mask. And but we just did a terrible job of humanizing care during this time. And I think the way we put people in nursing facilities is it's terrible. And I think the pain and suffering that has gone on for people with cognitive disorders and those who are just in facilities for other reasons, I think it was horrendous. And I hope we rethink this whole process, because I'd hate to see us go through it again.
Thank you for that. I want to follow up on that, and I'm seeing in the chat a reminder to the audience to please submit any questions that you have. And I just have a couple of more questions for Cindy and Bruce, and then I know they would love to hear from the audience. But I wonder if, and it may be too early to reflect on this, but I really appreciated the last thing that you said. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the takeaways are. Like, are there particular lessons to be learned from this crisis that might help us to do things better?
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to look after elders with cognitive impairment, but if you know, it's a reflection of who we are in a society, how well we treat them. And nursing homes are run, almost all of them, for profit. They work on a very small margin. And I think the idea that we need infrastructure to help with the care of elders, that we need to pay caregivers who are often, you know, paid nothing, and the burden on them is catastrophic and they get sick. So I think it is an opportunity for us to rethink our whole healthcare system. And I think some of the things, don't want to sound political, but that we're talking about with infrastructure is exactly preventing the sort of catastrophe that we had in prisons, in nursing facilities, you know, with mental illness during this period, just savagely hard for people. And that reflects on the society.
Cindy, did you want to add anything, or I can just go? I have one final question before we turn to the audience. Maybe you can just add it in then if you want to. So my last, so since we're speaking of audience, I wonder who you imagined or hoped would read this book, and you know, what kinds of things would you like people to take away from the reading?
So I think Bruce did a great job answering that other question. So I will just go on to this question of audience, because that was the $64,000 question. Who were we writing this book for? And it changed over time. I have to say, initially, I really wanted to write this book for me, and I wanted to write it for my dad, and I wanted to write it with Bruce. That is as much as I knew deep down. And then as I started learning more about neurology, and as the arc of the book started taking shape, I realized I think this book might actually help people. I think I always knew having Bruce involved, it would be really helpful in terms of giving readers information about dementia. And I knew that Bruce knew his stuff inside out and was exactly the right person to be able to write about these very difficult things in clear, reader-friendly language. And then for me, I started realizing that talking about my own process of grieving could be really beneficial as well. And that it was very important for me to share with readers what I thought I did right, what I thought I did wrong, what I had no idea what I was doing, that I was a deer in the headlights when I was in my mid-20s, and it took me till I was 60 years old to get to the other side. And just to be as honest as I could about the complexities of my own grief process. But I also came to realize that the process of grieving around dementia, I mean, all grief is very complicated, but you're saying goodbye, but not really. It's an extremely protracted goodbye. And I remember when my brother called and told me that Dad was dying. This was after decades of him being sick. It was like I was hearing it for the first time. I forgot he was dying, because my life with my father and my family had been seeing Dad in the nursing home. And so why would it end? And so kind of being able to talk about the grief process, I thought could really be helpful for readers. And I just wanted to say to readers, like, it's okay if you're having a hard time, it's okay, forgive yourself. I didn't forgive myself. I finally kind of forgiven myself, and just kind of getting into the messiness of grief, and also talking about how my love of literature helped me get through it. And so to get back to the original point of your question, who's this for? It's really for anyone who is specifically dealing with dementia, dealing with grief, saying goodbye, pretty much for anybody. And we try to write it that way. Bruce, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would just say something personal. Like, this was a little hard for me, particularly the last chapter that we wrote together about memory, because my mom she'd lived 94 incredible years, and Cindy made me think a lot about her, and her grief sort of rebounded with me as well. And then the isolation of COVID, it was just so horrendous. And so I think that the grief part, it stays with you all the time. And my mother died about 6 months ago from COVID. In retrospect, I really wish she hadn't been in assisted living. I mean, it was a terrible mistake we made as a family, and I'll never quite forgive myself about it. And this goes on forever. And I think this is something that if we don't deal with it, it haunts us. And I think Cindy did such a gorgeous job of taking us through grief and explaining it to us and laying it out what happens. And I think her piece of the book is very moving, and I hope, in terms of who we hope read it, I hope as many people as possible read it, because I think it has a wonderful message.
Thank you both so much. I am going to ask Becca if we should turn to I don't see any questions in the chat, but should we see whether anyone has a question they want to ask? Oh, wait a minute.
There's one. So it looks like Sarah Weinstein is asking, do you envision a future collaboration?
Bruce?
We do. We're talking about it now. We have to figure out what it'll be, but I learned so much from this experience, and Cindy's got, I think, a little bit more advanced ideas about what we might do. Maybe you could say a few words, Cindy, but we will do more writing together. I'm sure of it. It was just too important to me to stop it.
Yeah, I have a couple of ideas circulating. One is a YA book about Alzheimer's. Our book is listed as 18 and older, but being able to talk with people younger than that, I think, could be hugely important. There's been research that the number of people with early onset is much greater than any of us had thought. And so reaching a slightly different readership, I think, could be really beneficial. The other idea that I've talked to Bruce about is reaching out to, this would be sort of a more academic book, but one of the things that my sections of the book talk about is the relation between dealing with illness in the family and then carrying on professionally. And for me, the way to tell that story was about how literature was the container for my grief, the escape from my grief. But when I walk around Caltech or really talk to anyone, everyone knows someone who's dealing with a loved one with dementia, and thinking about reaching out to maybe some of the biologists at Caltech who actually study dementia, who have a family member dealing with it, I think could be a really interesting next project. So those are two things that I'm playing around with at the moment.
It looks like there's another question from Caroline. What were some of the challenges in writing this book together, and how did you address them?
I could say a couple of challenges. One is I never met Jerry Weinstein, and I was completely reliant on Cindy's sort of vibrant history. And I think I really got to understand him, his strengths, his weaknesses, things I really like to know about when I think about someone with an illness. That was, that was hard though, not having records, not having anything to look at. And then the other part that was kind of hard was there wasn't a lot of behavior and that's kind of my expertise, is writing about, the frontal lobes and their influence on how we behave. And that just really wasn't part of the story. So we decided it was important to talk about behavior, but it came a little later. And then the third thing is I touched on was that I just felt very restrained, constrained by the language that we have to describe memory. And I think we have so many things about memory that we don't understand and we glibly, jump over. And I came to grips with that when I wrote the memory chapter. It was really hard. It was really hard. Yeah.
For me, the difficulties were slightly different. I would tell Bruce a story and he would say, okay, that's the kernel of a chapter. So I already described how the hearing anecdote became part of the chapter on diagnosis. And then the behavior chapter happened. I was telling Bruce a story about my father, who was always very, very gentle. He pulled a sink out of the wall in the nursing home. And I didn't see it, I only heard about it. And I was proud of him for being so angry that he wasn't passive in the face of the disease. And I wanted to talk about that in the chapter, because Bruce said to me after I told him that story, he's like, okay, so your father did have behaviors, you didn't necessarily see them, but as the disease progresses, the whole brain is sort of getting decimated. And even though behavior wasn't an initial symptom, at the end it was. And in writing that chapter, I came to grips with some other behaviors that were haunting. So that was difficult, very difficult. Another hard thing was structural. I had thought the memory chapter would come first because it seems to me in sort of everyday language, Alzheimer's is all about memory. And what Bruce said to me is, no, the memory chapter needs to come at the end. And that was so true and illuminating, because what I realized was that I had lost my memory. My father was losing his memory because of his brain. And then I was losing my memory of my healthy father because it was too painful to remember him as healthy. And so writing that final chapter about memory was my opportunity to sing for my father. And I imagined the catalog that I wrote in that memory chapter as a kind of symphony for my dad, and just a proliferation of all the really fun and beautiful memories I had of him. So those were my challenges.
That is so beautiful.
Yeah.
So it looks like there's another question. What have you observed in cases where people choose to learn whether or not they're genetically predisposed to having dementia?
I think it goes back to Rachel's earlier question, which is how much do people want to know, and could it be harmful knowing too much? And I think when we face a genetic case, we tread very softly and cautiously because we don't want to do harm. I think it's a particularly precarious when you don't have a great therapy yet for learning about a genetic disorder. So I think this is changing. And I believe that the first forms of Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia and the Parkinson's disease that will be cured are the genetic forms, because I think we can intervene early before someone is symptomatic. We know the exact molecule responsible for the illness. And I think we really are starting to get some wonderfully scientific molecular approaches. So so I think that's where we are with genetics. We're very, you can find out a lot of things genetically on the internet and through 23andMe. And I understand why these businesses exist, but I think we're more cautious in academic world. We want to talk with people about what they want to know, what the implications of knowing mean for them and for a family. And so I think we tread very carefully in this space, knowing that knowing too much can actually, or knowing things you don't want to know. The great writer Norman Cousins wrote about physicians caring for him. He said, I don't need my doctor to tell me that I have a fatal illness that I'm going to die from in 8 months and offer no other hope. And I think a lot about those words, when I deal with people. And I think we're often wrong. They were wrong about Norman Cousins. He lived many, many years and devised his own strategies of dealing with his illness. So I think a great question of great complexity for us in the neurology field right now.
All right, so it looks like we have a couple more questions. Fonda has two questions, one of which is, has the process of working together on this book impacted the way in which you approach the work that you do in each of your professions? Start with that one.
I have been increasingly interested in writing for a general audience. And I think that even as I go on to my next American literature project, this issue of who you're writing for persists, and my sense of audience is much larger. And as a result, I hope that the literary criticism that I continue to write will be written in a way that it's more accessible than perhaps it's been in the past. I know that's an oblique way of answering the question, but it's the truth. I also may at some point, and Rachel and I were talking about this before the session started, offer a class on memoir and illness at Caltech at some point. I want a little bit more distance from the book I just wrote, but I can imagine assigning Rachel's amazing memoir in that class, as well as Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking. There are a host of memoirs that I would really be interested in teaching. And so I can imagine that having written this book and having done all the research for the book will bear fruit in the classroom at some point.
Rachel, could you tell people about your memoir and what you wrote about? I think it's important since Cindy mentioned it.
Oh, no, that's too incredibly nice. This is not supposed to be about me. So, but in one sentence, I have a son with Down syndrome. And so it's the story of the first few years of his life and, you know, everything that I learned. And one of the things that makes me excited about the book you've just written is that in writing, so first of all, while I wrote this book, I ended up having a lot of opportunities to speak with healthcare providers, geneticists, genetic counselors, but then even better, once the book was out in the world, to interact, like I've had the chance to speak at medical schools and hospitals. And I think that has been one of the most valuable experiences to me, is to get to speak to healthcare providers outside of the very alienating and rushed space of an office. So I really hope that more will come from this collaboration, both in terms of more wonderful books for the world, but also perhaps suggestions for how patients and doctors can reproduce the kind of dialogue that, I mean, there's something about the leveling of collaboration that seems so valuable after the medical encounter just creates so much hierarchy and distance. Anyway, I hope so.
That's wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity to plug my my book. It's a book about parenting
and how important to the Down community and the physicians. We have at our Global Brain Health Institute a woman from Barcelona, Spain, who is working in this space. And, you know, I think they do it a little better in Spain than we do, and think a lot more about what it's like to, you know, live in this community. So I know how important what you have done is.
Well, I will say one final point of connection is that people with Down syndrome are far more likely to develop Alzheimer's than the general population. And so, well, I don't especially love this argument, but one argument people make for, you know, let's not go trying to eliminate all people with Down syndrome, because their brains are valuable. We need to study what's going on in their brains, because they can be of help to everyone else. And I also think that a lot of the accommodations developed for people with disabilities are now being applied to people with dementia and the elderly. And so just a little plug for the importance of keeping people with all kinds of differences around in our communities.
Thank you. I wanted to answer Fonda's question too. So how did it change me? I think it made me realize I'm more vulnerable than I think. And it made me realize that my own personal memoir is an important part of how I give best care. And I think Cindy made me much more sensitive to what a caregiver and their family goes through. It was a real gift.
So Fonda's second question is just for Bruce. And it's wondering, has this reflective process changed the way in which you interact with your patient and with your patients and families?
Yeah, I mean, I think more aware of what they're feeling, particularly the families, and maybe more process around that. Yeah.
And Elise has a question. You've talked about audience for your book, so she's wondering, in what section of a bookstore would you hope to find it, or what keywords in an online store?
That's great.
That is a great question. I would say a few different places: memoir, dementia, Alzheimer's. Oddly enough, on Amazon.com, we're listed, Bruce, under musculoskeletal diseases. No idea how that happened.
Yeah.
And maybe literary criticism, maybe. at number one. So I think that one of the things I'm really proud of in this book is that it belongs in a bunch of different places in a bookstore. It's deeply interdisciplinary, and this gets back to the audience question. It hopefully resonates with a lot of different kinds of readers.
And we have to read what Kathleen Carter says. Did you see that, Cindy?
I did.
Yeah.
All right, so it looks like that's the last of our questions. So I just want to thank you three so much for being here. We are so honored to be able to host this event. And I just want to remind people that I put the link in the chat of where you can buy the book. And please support us, and please support Cindy and Bruce. We'd really appreciate it. And I just hope everybody has a great evening. And thanks again. If anybody else has any last words they want to say, feel free. But thank you so much.
Well, Cindy and I are really grateful. What a wonderful event. Thank you so much, Becca. Rachel, thank you. That was, we learned a lot from hearing how you thought about this. So, and thanks to the audience.
Huge gratitude. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for including me.
Bye. Thank you.
Everyone.